Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Let's do some talking about a book, shall we, just for fun. So I'm currently working on a very lengthy process which demonstrates that the feminist movement, intersectionality, and also the critical studies, that is, critical theory, critical race theory, etc., are actually theological in origin. They are religious in their nature. They share a common religious origin point. Currently, I'm going through the Feminism and Intersectionality. This will include women's studies as a form of religion, and I'm going to be demonstrating comprehensively in a video probably sometime in the next few months how and why that is the case. Today I would like to discuss one of the at least half dozen books which I'm going through. This one in particular is Anne Wilson Schaef, a book titled Women's Reality, An Emerging Female System in a White Male Society. This is a book which was published in 1981 originally. The current edition that I am reading from is the 1992 second edition. This is somewhat relevant because the second edition contains an introduction which was not present in the first one, which marks a change in perspective that the author had through that 10-year period. And the other reason to go through this particular book is that this book deems itself to be a women's studies book. On the back cover of the book, it even states that it is a women's studies book. On the front cover, it boasts that 300,000 copies of this particular book have been sold. Of course, this was true in 1992, the year of publication. By today's date, it will of course have sold many, many more. So this book is one which can certainly be said to be influential within the canon of feminism, within the canon of women's studies. It is a book that you can find on women's studies courses, you can find it in university libraries, you can even find it as required reading for certain courses in those universities. So this is not some fringe, out-there conspiracy theory tome, as no doubt some people will attempt to paint it. No, this is very much a mainstream part of the canon of the movement. If you would like to see me discussing this book with a few other people, you can do so over on Honey Badger Radio, where I went through a write-up about this book and we discussed it over the course of about 6 or 7 hours, divided into 2 parts. Of course, that is quite a long and slow process, and I would understand if you don't want to go through something in such a lengthy fashion and have it derailing into a variety of other topics which are all related but somewhat expanding on points which are not necessarily completely relevant to the book, but just tying it to other things which are happening either in the present day or that have happened over the last 3 decades since the book was published. So in this video, I'm basically going to be going through the write-up which I did in those live streams. I will be ad-libbing in a few little extra details here and there which I might consider to be necessary for your understanding because, of course, even though this write-up is written for pseudo-public consumption, it is also a note to me for the larger project which I am attempting to undertake. And as such, some of the points may need to be a little bit expanded upon when we get there. So without further ado, let's get directly into the write-up talking about the book Women's Reality, An Emerging Female System in a White Male Society by Anne Wilson Schaef. The author's notes from the 1992 edition, these are quite important to understanding the frame of mind that she was in when writing this book and how her point of view came to change over time. The author has changed her view regarding what she calls in this book the white male system and the female system. These terms will be expanded upon later. She states she was in her fairness phase when she wrote this book, and she now believes that the white male system and the female system are both collaborative sides of what she has now termed the addictive system. The addictive system does not support life nor living. The female system has since become known to her as the living process system, which is life-supporting and life-sustaining. 10 years on from this book's first publication, and the author basically declares that the white male system, which is a Gramsci hegemon-style system, is a system of death for humanity and the planet, and we all need to move to the female system so that we and the planet will not die. This is heavily influenced by the religious New Age thinking school via the school of Gnostic immanentism as described by people such as Eric Voegelin, an author who I highly recommend you look up in your own time. but this combines with the borderline New Age female divine view of humanity, as can be seen throughout the book, and how the author describes the female system, female thinking, and women's ways of knowing and becoming. Becoming is a Hegelian and later Marxist term for the dialectic process, the thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis. The synthesis end is the process of becoming. For more information on this, you can read about Hegel and the concept of Aufheben. Throughout this book, system theory is used. System theory can simply be the observation of things and how they interact. However, it can also be an immanentist view of history as described by Vogelin. The immanentist view can be found in the philosophies of Hegel and his dialectic method, the idea that all thoughts have an opposite that results in two conflicting ideals, usually irreconcilable conflict. These ideas, the thesis and its opposing antithesis, must be melded together in synthesis, the combination of both together thus working out the conflict. The reason this results in immanentist thinking is that the end result of Hegel's thought process is that eventually all contradictions will be synthesized. This will result in the end of history, humans reaching a not properly defined utopia free of contradiction and conflict. This is within the framework of the death of God, where humans have become effectively divine because they know all of the things. Even Marxist dialectic materialism uses this framework. They just use different words to obscure the theological underpinning of their ideas. Page 2 of this book literally says that the understanding or defining of female system theory comes from synthesis, not analysis. Analysis is described in this book as white male system thinking. The author mentions how having objectives and defined routes to get there is restricting and limiting because it is white male system thinking. Female system thinking is based on process, not results. Female system thinking focuses on the processes of vaguely defined understanding and growth, and this is referenced throughout the book, i.e. the synthesis of becoming, although the author does not use those words very frequently. The author states on page 4 that this book is not the answer and may cause conflict and facilitate growth, aka this book will put people through the dialectic process. On page 5, the author states that if men do not understand the mystical woo that they are reading, that they should discuss this book with 5 women, 3 of whom are feminists, also known as submit to the struggle session. It is also somewhat amusing to note that 40 years on from this book's publication, the phrase educate yourself and it's not my job to educate you has become a mainstay of the feminist position. So what is the white male system? The white male system is where the power and influence of society lies with white males. It didn't happen overnight. It's a long process of evolution upheld by everyone. You can see why earlier I referenced the concept of Gramsci and the hegemon, because that is basically a description of his way of thinking. It is also important to note that the author in this book asserts that it is just a system and does not reflect reality. Even when the white male system attempts to measure reality and be objective, it is just asserting its dominance and maintaining itself without the actors within the system knowing or understanding how or why. You can see this sort of attitude prevalent in modern feminists and intersectionalists in the concept of things such as the panopticon, which for those who have not heard of it before, the panopticon is visualized as a jail with a central tower where all of the inmates in the jail cannot see guards in the tower, but the guards in the tower can see all of the people within the prison. This hypothetically leads the prisoners to always behave as though they are being monitored, even if there are no guards within the tower. As such, they become somewhat self-policing or at the very least self-regulating. The problem, of course, with a panopticonic view of the world is that it requires you to be able to demonstrate that there is a guard tower, or at least was a guard tower at some point, and that there were guards in that tower at some point, and that at some point in time those guards made their presence known to the inmates of the jail. This is, of course, something that feminists and intersectionalists do not do because they cannot. Back to the book, the author asserts that the white male system decides what is knowledge and how it is taught. The white male system envelops all other systems, including the capital B black system, Native American system, Asian system, and female system. You can see this later reflected in concepts such as everything is racist, everything is sexist, everything is homophobic, and you need people who understand the other systems to point it all out, because white males can't or won't understand any other system than the white male system. The author then goes on to clarify in this regard that she not only had to learn this by herself, but that she also had to be helped along by two black people. This was specifically so she could learn not if she was racist, but how she was racist. Throughout this book, the white male system is analogized to pollution. It is everywhere, and you're so used to it that you can't see it. The author asserts that the Native Americans saw it first, the blacks who went their own way to make out their own system saw it second. And this is a basic loose defense that the author uses for ghettos and gang culture 40 years on, but this isn't addressed. The author then goes on to make some interesting claims regarding race, such as because black people don't accept the white male system that they live in, they have increased rates of strokes and heart attacks, high blood pressure, and ulcers. This is because the white male system says that white men are superior. This of course relies on this assertion being true, however if you actually look at some statistics regarding things such as blood pressure for black people, you end up with grey areas and in some cases finding the exact opposite of what this author has asserted. The author goes on to assert that women who accept the white male system also suffer the same. The white male system kills everyone who isn't a white male, because they learn to accept their inferiority and die from stress. This author, of course, choosing to ignore aggregate differences in life expectancy between men and women, because, of course, in reality, men die younger than women. However, of course, attempting to measure that objectively is just me being a white male system thinker. Objective reality doesn't matter. The author goes on to assert that there are four major myths holding up the white male system. 1. It is the only system, and that system is reality. Anyone denying it is labelled crazy, especially women. This leads to the need for white male system validation, see myth 3. The second myth, the white male system is innately superior to other systems, which is interesting since it is apparently also the only one. 3. The white male system knows everything and understands all. This is why women need validation from men. 4. It is possible to be objective, logical, and rational. Yes, this author is asserting that objectivity, logic, and rationality don't reals and are impossible. Most importantly, the author asserts that this fourth myth leads to denying intuition, subjectivity, and feelings, which are ways of female system thinking. The white male system thinking leads men to believe they are innately superior. On page 18, the author says an anecdote that didn't happen to prove her point. In a session, she told people these myths, and one man became angry and said, "If what you're saying is true, I'm nothing but a piece of shit. If I'm not innately superior, and I don't know or understand everything, then I'm nothing but a piece of shit, just like the rest of you." As with a lot of this author's anecdotes that didn't happen, you'll notice that they are all basically "and then everyone stood up and clapped" tier fanfiction. Anytime I reference an anecdote from this author, you are very free to hear "this did not happen." In another session run by this author, who works as a psychologist and therapist, she claims that another angry white man said, "If you get power, you'll do the same thing to us as we've done to you." This is in regards to oppressing women and non-white people since forever. The funny thing is, 40 years on, and this man was actually correct. See the expansive definition of racism in critical race theory, and the past discrimination requires present discrimination rhetoric. On page 20, the author relays an anecdote about race consciousness. She makes white people and black people write about things that are white, things that are black, and things that are both. She alleges that black people wrote about white people things and black people things, whereas white people only wrote about white people things and both. This apparently broke the myth because the white people realized they are actually inferior to black people, because the black people knew more than they did. It has nothing whatsoever to do with white people not wanting to be called racist for delineating black behaviors. According to this book, the white male system is also religious, and the religion is science, and science can prove or disprove things within the system. The author then asserts that the only reason for white male system science is to dominate the universe, while the Native American system is just to live in peace and harmony with everything. The author goes on to assert that the white male system desires to be God, and that this manifests in the form of air conditioning and artificial lights. The white male system has embraced the scientific method and distorted it so as to achieve godhood. Later on in the book, the author will assert that women are just more accepting of the natural environment as is, and thus would not seek to make climate-controlled places. This is of course the opposite of reality. Women frequently work in climate-controlled environments by choice, and will often only enter a field of work once the environment is suitably controlled, safe, and in a state of homeostasis. The author goes on to assert that in its original form, science was about being open-minded and learning. Women and non-whites distrust science for good reason, because it doesn't make sense, according to this author. Quote, "We can be convinced that numbers are real, though we forget they are only symbols that represent our realities. Numbers are just words in a foreign language. We can learn to speak French and we can learn to speak numbers as well, but this does not mean that numbers have special powers. Yes, apparently maths doesn't represent anything. It's just a means of the white male system controlling the world." Going into page 40, the author asserts that men's authority and power is inherited and not earned, and gives us the typical spiel that men assume birthright power, influence, and status, etc. This is of course the opposite of reality. Men work their entire lives to succeed and provide worth to women. So the notes thus far and what we've talked about has covered what the white male system is, which is basically the use of science and mathematics to understand the objective truth of the reality that we inhabit. So what is the female system according to this author? Well, as the author says, the female system is philosophical, sociological, psychological, political, and theological. That's from page 6 of the book. And she states that there are actually two female systems. One, the reactive female system, which is how women survive in the white male system, and the second is the true female system, which is, quote, variable and changing. It is open-ended. The system will change and dichotomies between the female system and white male system will be worked out. This is Hegel's dialectic showing its face here. The second system is where women feel safest and can truly be themselves because it has no constraints such as hierarchy, objectivity, and time, which will be addressed later in this book. Chapter 2 of this book talks about the original sin of being female. The author asserts that women only attack other women because the white male system has made that their acceptable and preferred target. This is to stifle the growth of the female system. Note the dissonance here between this statement and Chapter 1's statement, where the white male system suppresses the female system while not understanding it or even knowing what it is. Quote, "When women say I don't like other women, what they're really saying is I don't like myself. This can be expanded to say I don't like femaleness." The author asserts that this means that women hold the position that being female is innately wrong. Women attempt to be things they are not, like tough and hard-working, so as to appease the white male system, to relieve themselves of feelings of guilt from the taint of being born female. The author relates several anecdotes of women wanting to do better, getting straight A's in school, working on a PhD thesis, and yet still having received job offers despite having not actually completed their education yet, fearing failure and not being accepted because of failure. Basically, women are human and have doubts about themselves sometimes and desire to achieve things, but the author asserts that this is because of the white male system and how the white male system has made women feel as though they are born inferior. The author goes on to state here that male therapists do not understand this innate feeling of inferiority that women have because of the white male system. Men apparently only struggle with feelings of inferiority because the white male system tells them they must be superior at all times. On the topic of women, the author says, quote, "They cannot understand how deeply the feelings of innate inferiority penetrate our being and how ever present they are." The author once again veers this into the topic of race, stating that no one can understand what it is to be capital B black because they didn't grow up black, and this is the same with women. Yes, apparently women are just unknowable if you are not one. This ties somewhat interestingly to the trans debate which has been happening in recent years regarding the second wavers who are frequently called TERFs by the third wavers. The second wavers seem to believe that there is some intangible, unmeasurable, wibbly-wobbly womanness to being a woman that makes them definitely a woman, and that this is somewhat a dualistic way of thinking, whereas the modern Marxist critical theorists state that you can be anything you want to be because it's all just a social construct and we can change it. There is nothing inherent to the label woman. This is a materialistic view that lacks any sort of metaphysical aspect. The author goes on to state that women learn event details as a means of coping with the white male system. This includes things such as remembering dates, remembering talks, remembering phrases, and even specific words used. And apparently women only do this so they can prove they are right at all times, so as to counter the white male system telling them that they are born wrong. Which is a very interesting take on women always having to be right in every argument. This veers us into the topic of divorce. The author asserts that the white male system tricks women into thinking that it is fair. Women find out the white male system is not fair when they get divorced, and women suffer emotionally and financially as they are stripped of the last sense of ultimate fairness. The author states she has a female judge friend who said they want to be fair but can't because the law isn't fair. My hypothesis on this is that the female judge wants to exercise in-group preference as hard as possible, but the law says you can't do that. This assertion regarding divorce also jives somewhat interestingly with objective reality, where women tend to get off a lot lighter in divorce courts than men, with many men having their lives completely destroyed by going through divorce. Steering from the topic of the legal system, on page 36 the author relays an anecdote to us. She states that a woman was pulled over by a police officer for no reason at all. She allegedly had a bumper sticker that virtue signaled a political orientation different from the state majority, i.e. she was a Democrat in a red state. A scuffle broke out when she was asked for her license and registration. She got arrested and when in the holding cell began smacking the bars with her shoes and screaming obscenities. Someone told her she wasn't acting like a lady and she replied, "Yes I am, white women are angry too." And then everyone stood up and clapped. Her ideals state that she should get a feminist lawyer, but she picked a man with a track record of winning. The author states the guy bullshits his way through the court proceedings by using a large briefcase stuffed with random bits of paper, and did this as a psychological weapon. He did win the case. The woman in question didn't go to jail and only had to pay fines. The author asserts that this man only won because of bullshit and not his competence at his job. Apparently, this anecdote shows that the white male system is unfair. Women develop an understanding so that they can survive the white male system. They gather information on everyone and everything and remember everything about relationships, so, quote, "we can understand why this or that happened, and we forgive." Women apparently only remember things in relationships to prove they are right and forgive people. They never bring things up from months or years ago that everyone else forgot about in order to point score and be cunty. It's all just them surviving the white male system and looking to have their sin of being born female forgiven. Moving on to the solar plexus hole in need of healing. On pages 40 and 41, the author talks about Freud and Erikson, and how they assert that women have an inner hole of being that needs filling. Freud and Erikson, of course, suggested penis and baby. Not because having a family is fulfilling to many women, despite the fact that married women consistently report greater levels of happiness. No, it's because those psychologists are men, according to this author. The author asserts that women experience the inner hole, a void, in their solar plexus. This is the hole where they maintain their original sin of being born female. They often adopt physical postures where they fold their arms over their solar plexus and hunch in on themselves to protect this vulnerability. The author notes, We often cover it with fat. Yes, the patriarchy/white male system is making women fat because they feel vulnerable, because they have a hole, because they are born wrong. The author states directly, women have eating and drinking problems so they can shrink and fill this void of female sin. The female system would help to heal and shrink this hole, but it is too easy to rip open again, such as losing a primary relationship. This is because the woman was using the male validation to fill her hole. On page 42, the author states, the hole contains the essence of being female in the white male system. Women fear being alone because they need male validation and goodies to absolve them of their sin of being born female. Women only seek marriage to acquire validation to fill their hole by finding a man who will absolve them of their sin. Of note here, I actually agree that people should not externalize their sense of validation or their locus of control and responsibility. This must be cultivated from within. However, this is not unique to women. Men also yearn for things outside themselves and external validation from others, usually women, since women provide men their sense of value, unless they undertake long hard reflection and self-growth so as not to require this external validation. The author in this book just does not understand men at all. She assumes all of the work men do to cultivate themselves, to grow and get better and gain competence, is just a birthright handed to them because penis. She is incapable of seeing the male struggle and drive. On page 46, the author goes on to state that she is not obnoxious. She is only told she is obnoxious because she is a female in a white male system. She filters her failures in life and finds that 90% of it is not because she is wrong, it's society that is wrong. The author goes on to assert that women are always told that they cannot be the in-group because of their sin. Women learn to lie to themselves and others about what they want and what they need. But once they open up to other women, they all learn that actually they are an in-group and they begin to heal and fill their holes. A note at this point in the book, this is somewhat unusual. Women have a strange dualism. They have automatic in-group preference and the halo effect, as we have discussed before over the years. However, as was noted by Williams in 2023, there is no sisterhood, and women constantly take each other down pegs in social standing so as to elevate themselves. Other studies regarding outcomes with women indicate women will reject a $100 payout if someone else receives $200 in favor of themselves receiving $50 and the other person receiving $0. Other studies reveal women are more likely to renege on previously struck deals so as to please another person in the moment, as opposed to men who prefer sticking to bargains made. Women receive a societal boon for being female. Their bad behavior is excused and they are perceived as being better. Simultaneously, women also see themselves as amazing, yet they are also duplicitous and backstabbing when compared to men. This book contains much New Age woo about this sisterhood aspect of women coming together, and asserts that women are only catty cunts to each other because the white male system makes it so. Also of note, the author implies if women had more sense of self from working, they would be happier. Interestingly, women's levels of unhappiness are consistently rising the more they attempt to fulfill the male role. And on page 48, the author asserts that society apparently laments, why can't women be more like men? Just another example of something that is the opposite of reality. On page 49, the author observes that women are angry, and that they should be angry. Anger runs their lives. They express their anger in many ways, such as making other people work hard, seducing men and leaving them hanging, being a good housewife and making men depend on her so that they can't function without her. The good Christian woman, the author calls this type of woman the worst of them all. Somewhat interesting because socialism is the religion that must replace Christianity. The good Christian woman goes without dessert, so as to make other people feel guilty. And all of this is because women are just angry because white male system. Yes, a woman apparently choosing to avoid obesity and diabetes is just a weapon to make other people feel guilty. And all of this is just because women are angry because the white male system exists. This is why we must destroy the white male system and institute the female system. The next part of this book talks about men as God and needing to become God. This is from page 60 onwards. The author asserts that women hate men's superiority and their birthright to superiority. Apparently, men can't learn the female system well, and this is because they have no impetus to, according to this author. As she says here, men are brainwashed by society and by women into thinking they are superior. Many women devote their lives to caring about the fragile male ego. This is apparently also why some women struggle to break free from the white male system. There's a very interesting anecdote on page 62, which is somewhat revealing here, where the author talks about how there are women in the world who pretend not to care about politics, or not to understand politics, and this is so that they can convince men to do their dirty work for them. And this is somewhat an interesting revelation, and somewhat hints at something which we've known about for a number of years now, and this is something called power by proxy, where women will use men to achieve their own ends so that they don't have to receive any blowback or indeed any recognition that the woman themselves was an impetus point for whatever it is that they want to get done. This also ties very neatly to other concepts such as violence by proxy. This is something which comes up every so often in discussion, sometimes around men's rights, but also around women's rights as well, where in some cases women, rather than performing an act of violence themselves against someone, usually a man, they will instead get a proxy to perform the violence for them, whether that is a male family member, a male friend, or indeed the mostly male law enforcement. And here we're talking about things such as false allegations that a man has been abusing her, has raped her, something along those lines. Also on page 62, the author talks very interestingly about something that she calls pseudopod egos and asserts that men have egos that are like pseudopods. She states that men's egos pull women in towards them and devour them, and thus make the women indistinguishable from the male ego, and women play out their lives according to this male ego so as to validate themselves. This leads us on to page 63, which is interesting in the fact that it talks about divorce, and it says that men's pseudopod egos cause him to believe what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine, where women just know what they came into the relationship with and they just want it back. According to this author, women never overreach or attempt to take far more than what they came into a relationship with when they get divorced. This is, of course, the exact opposite of reality. There are plenty of high-profile divorces where we've seen things like this happen, and there are plenty of low-profile divorces as well, the everyday things where men get taken to the cleaners, lose access to their home, their car, frequently access to their children as well, all because women push for things like sole custody and demand far more than they came into the relationship with. You can especially see this manifest in regards to things such as keeping her in a manner to which she has become accustomed, which is a fairly common standard that you find in divorce courts. The idea that a woman going into a relationship and then choosing to become a stay-at-home mother or a homemaker has given up some sort of highly lucrative career elsewhere, and as such a man has to continually pay her effectively for nerfing her own life in such a manner. Or you can take it in the most literal sense of keeping her in the manner to which she has become accustomed, where a woman has achieved a certain level of lifestyle and now that just becomes her baseline. It can never be reduced or diminished because if you do, that is somehow morally reprehensible. Apparently there is a legal standing in life when it comes to women that the projection of their life can only ever be level or upwards. It can never be allowed to come down. Even though this is a legal standard that comes up every so often in various courts in various countries, your mileage may vary of this depending by the country that you're in and regions within those countries. There's also a fairly typical anecdote from the author talking about how women's ideas are not accepted and men need to pitch their ideas for them in order for them to become accepted. This is somewhat interesting because in recent years we've of course seen a similar sentiment rising up in the feminist camp, except they will bemoan the fact that men pitch women's ideas for them, claiming that this is some sort of theft of intellectual rights or intellectual property or something along those lines, or they'll just outright say that this shows people's contempt for women because an idea will only be taken seriously if it comes from a man. So it's very interesting to go back 40 years and see the progenitor point of that. So not only does the author imply that ideas won't be accepted because they come from women, but you tie that into the earlier point where women pretend to not care about something or pretend to not know something so as to get men to do it for them. There's a very interesting dichotomy between those two positions. This is not to suggest that people are incapable of doing two different things, they very obviously can, but it's just very interesting that both of these things, contradictory as they may seem to be, get acknowledged in this book. On page 69, the author makes a very bizarre assertion, and this bizarre assertion is that men can touch women whenever they want as a means of exerting power over them, and when women touch men, everyone is appalled by such an action. This is the exact polar opposite of reality, especially in modern society. Men cannot touch women seemingly for any reason in society anymore, because they will be accused of, in the worst case scenario, rape or sexual assault, which will lead to legal repercussions, or they will simply lose any and all social standing and potentially their job for being called a creep or something along those lines. We've seen the rhetoric enough to know what's going on here. However, women very frequently see no such censure on their ability to touch other people. Interestingly, this not only applies as being a difference between the sexes, but is also especially applicable towards children. As a man, you are basically forbidden in modern society from touching children in public unless they are your own. This can even include in a friendly manner, such as giving a child that you know a hug, or an affectionate tap on the head or shoulder or something along those lines. Whereas, of course, in modern society, women are just presumed to be these naturally fantastic caregivers and naturally assumed to not be a danger to children. Which is, of course, somewhat interesting given the recent case of the nurse who murdered several children in the UK, and the massive outrage that this has caused, because it revealed the PR and HR nightmare behind the scenes of the NHS trust that she was working for. Coming off the back of divorces and touching, on page 70 the author asserts that men must take the role of approacher in relationships, and this is to maintain and assert his power. 40 years on, and the fragile female ego, as I've called it, screams for men to approach them so that they can say no. 40 years of feminist indoctrination and the #MeToo movement has made the average man terrified of approaching women, lest they be called a rapist or a creep. The relationship between the sexes has been destroyed. Men are checking out, and have been since the 2000s, because women do not motivate them with love and compassion. Risk of divorce is too high, mostly caused by women, to the order of about 70 to 80%. There is no motivation for most men to form formal relationships. In response, women are now also checking out to work lazy girl jobs and swipe endlessly on a cock carousel of chads on social media dating apps. This makes everyone miserable, and has resulted in a demographic time bomb because of lack of stable families and lower birth rates combined with escalating immigration rates. Feminism and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. As the author goes on to note, the white male system values objectivity and results. The female system, however, values process and everyone feeling something. According to this author, men aim to control nature, with regards to things such as climate control, whereas women are just happy to accept things as they are. This is the exact opposite of reality once again. Broadly speaking, jobs that are in unpleasant environs are male-dominated. When these jobs become more climate-controlled and safer, then you tend to see an influx of women into those industries. You can very clearly see this divide in things such as mining, deep-sea fishing, waste disposal. Pretty much any job that is thoroughly unpleasant and frequently not climate-controlled will be dominated by men, whereas jobs which are safer, usually indoors and therefore frequently climate-controlled, these are more likely to be occupied by women and will normally be the jobs that women will gun for in companies. Even in trades which are traditionally male-dominated because they are either physically hard to do or environmentally uncomfortable, such as building, construction, things like that, you may find some women working in those industries, but they will more often than not be in reception or managerial roles, sitting in an office, managing spreadsheets. This is not to downplay the importance of those jobs, it is merely to note the difference in gender divide between different areas of the company. Chapter 4 of this book goes on to talk about how the white male system oppresses women. The author notes that the white male system induces what she calls stoppers in women's thought process, one of which is apparently think of the poor men. This is a means of shaming women into not thinking about themselves by causing them to feel guilt for focusing on themselves rather than someone else. Going back to reference the dating market problems that we're seeing these days, and we can see exactly how this has played out. 40 years of telling women that they don't need to focus on anyone else and should only focus on themselves and their own wants and desires has led to increased problems in modern society. The idea that women can simply have laundry lists of demands and men are there to meet them, and that women's standards should never have to adapt to anything else. Once again, we're reminded of slightly depressing dating survey information indicating that women believe about 80% of men to be below average attractiveness. And the modern meme of the however many number of sixes that men are required to meet in order to date women, notably the 6 foot tall, 6-pack abs, 6-figure income, and 6-inch genitalia. A combination of which, if one man possessed all of these sixes, would land him in the 0.01% of humanity. On page 78, the author makes a very interesting claim, and that is, equality cannot be externally assigned until it has been internally perceived. Women must apparently feel equal so that they are equal, and women's equality is predicated on the feeling of equality, rather than actual objectively measurable equality, because as this book repeatedly demonstrates, attempting to be objective and attempting to measure things is white male system thinking, and therefore must be abandoned. Very interestingly, on page 79, the author then actually admits the question of what do women really want cannot actually be answered. This will no doubt be because we cannot measure things, we cannot be objective, everything has to go by feelings, and everything has to go by process. On page 82, the author mentions that feminists use feminism to bully other women by saying they aren't feminist enough or you're not really a feminist. The author never reflects on this and her ideals of sisterhood. Quote, when the female system ideas become dogmas to which women must conform or be labeled sick, crazy, stupid, or even worse, counter-revolutionary, they become stoppers too. Here we see once again the female system is this fluid, ever-changing thing. Even female system ideas can be oppressive if held to too rigidly. Once again, women and their ways of knowing are seen as this amorphous, wibbly-wobbly womanness that defies understanding and definition. This is ultimately the point of this level of New Age woo. It makes it impervious to critique because it cannot be defined, because defining things is white male system. Females and female system is process-oriented and values how things are done more than results. On page 83, the author talks about innocence with wisdom. She asserts that society creates a difference between wisdom and innocence, that knowing things makes you not innocent. Being wise means not being innocent of the world. However, the author asserts that, in typical New Age woo fashion, you can be both. Have your feet on the ground and the head in the stars, as she says. On top of being New Age woo, this is Hegelian dialectic thinking. Thesis and antithesis have synthesized, and now you can be both things within the contradiction at the same time. On page 85, the author goes on to address the topic of children. She states that a mother loves her son, but he is part of the class that has oppressed her, and so she cannot help but feel rage and hostility towards him. On page 86, she states, the power of these little beings, our children, have over us, and the fact that they can validate our existence makes us hate their guts. We love our children, but hate what they stand for. The author then relates a tale, and as with all of this author's anecdotes, it didn't happen, but we'll talk about it anyway. In this story, she gives birth to her first child, a daughter, and alleges that one of the nursing staff told her, "Too bad your first was a girl, better luck next time." Upon the birth of her second child, a son, another member of the nursing staff commented to the author, "You finally did it. I guess since you've got a son now, you won't want any more children." Both of these things did not happen. This is the author once again living in her fantasy land of female oppression. On page 87, the author states that women raise their daughters to be oppressed by the white male system by teaching them to be ladylike. Women recognize each other as an oppressed class and become simpatico as a means of survival, and feel this bond traveling from solar plexus to solar plexus. This is especially true of daughters. This is a bond built through suffering. If we are all to be bonded, we must suffer. If we stop suffering, we lose all connection. And then on page 89, the author goes on to assert that women foist motherhood onto other women as a means of validating their own misery in the white male system. As an interesting side note here, talking about children and their relationship to feminism, when you discover that all of this is based on New Age woo, and how this all ties to a pseudo-Gnostic idea, that the world is a carceral construct where your spirit is locked away, where you have been separated from the source, or from God, or from this central point of energy in the universe, however you want to imagine it. It's interesting to note here that the author then goes on to basically point out that things that tie you to this material world, such as having children, is therefore going to be bad for you. This is because this point of view comes from a fundamentally spiritual position, the idea of freeing your spirit from this carceral hellhole so as to return to the central point of the universe where all consciousness will merge into one. As such, it becomes necessary to see children in such a world as something that is preventing your spirit from ascending to its higher plane of vibrational being by keeping you moored physically and thus spiritually to the material world. This goes on to explain why feminists view abortion as this sacrosanct which can never be touched, and getting rid of it will only serve to oppress women. This is because by removing abortion, you will moor women physically and spiritually to this realm, whereas the spiritual underpinning of this movement requires women to be completely free, so that they can return to being the idealized vibrational beings of light, ascendant beyond this material world and returning to source. The feminist and women's rights movement desire to abort children is about freedom, but not in the way that you might think. This leads us on to page 90, where the author talks about rage. Women are convinced that their rage is dangerous as an atomic bomb. What happens when women get mad? Men avoid or abandon her. She is left alone, according to the author. What actually happens in reality when women get mad is that men die. And this is because of blaming and the aforementioned cases of proxy violence. Women are taught from birth to not be violent, aggressive, or angry. The author asserts that this must be changed to validate how women feel. And the author then states on page 92, "It doesn't matter if it makes sense. That women feel is valid and cannot be inappropriate." This is rhetoric, of course, that continues on to this day. If a woman feels something, then that thing is true, and we must listen and believe. On pages 92 and 93, the author goes on to talk about therapy, in which she states that female system therapists must validate female feelings. Denying female feelings is white male system thinking. Quote, "Therapy for women must confirm the female experience, whatever that may be. In the past, reality testing has often meant testing out the white male system reality, which may have nothing at all to do with female system reality. The therapeutic process must validate the woman's experience of her own reality and help her understand it. Women must never be talked out of their perceptions. If a woman feels she is discriminated against at work, then of course she is. If she feels she is married to a chauvinist, then of course she is. Women know a great deal about healing themselves. They need not be encouraged nor judged. They need to be set free, not led along. Most of all, they need to feel good about what they are doing. They so rarely have this experience that therapists should do their best to facilitate it. Further to this, on page 97, the author asserts there is always truth in blaming, and that when a woman blames something or someone, it is necessarily true. And she even goes on to state after that, quote, "I have yet to meet a woman who can go on blaming forever." My note next to that quote is, this author has never met a woman. On page 99, the author states, when a woman is working through her rage phase, her therapist should never try to get her to see the other side. Women must not try to empathize with or understand the feelings of others. Only her feelings are valid. And the final stage of this author's guide to therapy is what she calls the awareness stage, in which women are aware of the white male system and they trust themselves and other women. If she is accused of being a white male system in her actions or thinking, then she may actually be being white male system, but she's just using it because it's congruent with her needs. In other words, the white male system apparently may be part of the female system when used correctly by women. The female system once again being this new age, undefinable wibbly-wobbly womanness woo that defies any and all understanding or categorization. In chapter 5, the author goes on to state that the white male system can be analogized as a form of pollution, and goes on to reference the concept of defining time. Quote, in the female system, as well as other racial systems, time is perceived as a process, a series of passages, a series of interlocking cycles which may or may not have anything to do with the numbers on a clock. Frequently, the clock is irrelevant and may even be seen as interfering with the process of time. Early, late, and on time are just concepts with no real meaning. The author goes on to assert that women bought into white male system time the most, and that blacks were then usually within half an hour of being on time, as the white male system would call it, and finally Native Americans might be days or weeks late. This is rather an interesting statement from this author, basically saying that non-white people can't understand the concept of linear time. There are reasons that the author talks about these ideas of racial systems and this idea of time as these interlocking cycles that don't really have any particular meaning or bearing on anything. This stems from these points of view having their origin in theosophy. Theosophy is a religious position which married together Eastern and Western mysticisms and occultism, combining things such as esoteric Buddhism with Christian Gnosticism, Jewish Kabbalah, and would even branch out into things such as Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. Unfortunately, a lot of these things have been marred by misunderstanding and, in some cases, outright actually conspiracy theories. I know that term gets abused a lot these days, but it is actually relevant to these topics. However, in the religion of theosophy, there is the concept that human beings are trapped within the world that we're in. We're trapped in material existence. This is something which you also find in Christian Gnosticism. And that the way that we escape this is by reaching a higher level of understanding. We come to learn things, we achieve the gnosis, the knowledge of how the world works and how the spirit works, and by achieving this position of knowledge, we are then able to leave this material world and return to source. Now, whether you consider that to be God, or some sort of combined spirit, or Mother Gaia, as some people would think of it, whether you think of it as being the Godhead or the monad, it doesn't really matter, the concept is the same. That all humans are basically spirits or fragments of spirit that came from one thing and were trapped in the material world in which we now live. And theosophy posits that all of this works around the concept of vibration. This is why when you see the New Age crystal woo people of Instagram and whatnot, they always talk about altering their vibrational frequencies and things like that. Well, that is a modern descendant of the theosophical idea, that by controlling your mental state, by controlling your spirit, you can physically alter the world around you through these vibrations, these emanations, and in doing so you can achieve this higher level of consciousness, this higher level of understanding, and potentially leave this world because you hit the right frequency, as it were. And of course, under this idea, when you achieve this knowledge, when you hit that right vibrational frequency, you will return to source, at which point time is this irrelevant thing. Because you're not in the material world, you're in this mysterious other spiritual realm where linear time doesn't actually exist, because it is eternal. It is a cycle. And part of the reason for that in theosophy, there is something actually called the Akashic Records. Now again, this is something that you hear it, and people might think, well, this is all just insane conspiracy theories and various other means of stopping you from talking about it or stopping you from thinking about it. No, this is what these people wrote in their books. You can go, you can read it, it is there, this is what people believed at the time. Of course, theosophy was the beginning point of these systems, and we're looking in this case here at a book from 1980, and so we've got this book separated from the original idea by about a century. So of course the idea has morphed over time. Certain parts of this religious thinking, certain parts of the spiritualism have been removed, and some new things may have been added in, but at fundament, these things are still there. So in theosophy, the Akashic Record is a written record of everything that has ever happened and everything that is ever going to happen. And it exists on one of these higher vibrational planes. And the idea is that if you can achieve this gnosis, you can achieve this knowledge, you can go through all of the rituals, all of the meditation, all of these things, you will be able to ascend to this vibrational plane, this higher level in spirit form, and you will have access to this eternal document that contains everything that will ever happen anywhere in the universe written down. And of course, when you know everything that is going to happen because you have a written document of it, time becomes irrelevant. Because you know everything that's going to happen anywhere, all the time, no matter what. This is where these ideas come from. And the author, by going through this bizarre racial casting system, is actually buying into a pseudo-form of spiritualism, which also helps to reinforce things like the noble savage myth. The idea that by being more on time in this reality means you are more moored to this reality. By being less on time, you are more spiritual, you are more attuned to the universe and its natural cycles where time doesn't actually matter, because you are closer to this spiritual source. This idea would later bleed out into people such as Hegel's writings and eventually into Marx's writings. The concept of things like dialectic struggle, the thesis-antithesis coming together into synthesis, which leads you to at some point having an inevitable end of history, at which point all contradictions have been worked out. You end up therefore achieving the gnosis, achieving the knowledge of things, and at that point humanity basically becomes, well, in the religious ideals of it, humanity becomes God, or something similar to it, because you know all of the things. Which is kind of similar to what is recommended in theosophy and the concept of the Akashic Record, if you think about it. But that is, of course, because all of these ideas share a similar origin point. As a side note here, talking about this racial casting system of white, black, and then Native American, and how they all have these different levels of wooiness, this is what led other people who had interests in theosophy and its various offshoots, people such as Heidegger, who would go on to help codify ideals such as German idealism, a term you may very well recognize for being popular with the Nazi Party of Germany in the 1930s. Of course, Heidegger wasn't the only person who talked about this, there were many others, that's just one name which comes up quite a few times on this topic, and if you follow that thread, you end up going on to things such as Nazi occultism and esoteric Hitlerism. So following the history and all of its various threads back in time, leads you in this very interesting and slightly uncomfortable position that feminism and Nazism actually hold a similar origin point, which is very interesting given the modern political tactic of people who are the far left, progressive, feminists, and Marxists constantly calling everyone who disagrees with them a Nazi, despite the fact that their ideas actually stem from the same place. But that is very far afield. Let us return to the author that we're talking about today and the concept of linear time and how it doesn't really exist. The author anecdotes that people who show up on time aren't really there because they stopped doing something in order to come to a meeting on time. So the author experimented and said at the start of any meeting that she would hold, go and do whatever it is that you were doing before you came to this meeting and then come back. This would mean that the meetings would start 10 to 20 minutes later than they should have. The author asserts that the remaining 40 to 50 minutes that actually was the meeting was more productive because everyone was really, quote, mind and body in the room, using her method of time. The dualistic implications there are very important, especially given what we just spoke about over the last few minutes. No evidence or metric is used to demonstrate this supposed improvement in output because of ignoring the clock, but as we've previously learned, asking for any sort of metric as to whether or not this was actually improved is just white male system thinking. If the author of this book says things were better, then they were better. On page 108, the author starts talking about relationships and how they are defined. She asserts that white male system thinking only operates in hierarchies. There is only above and below. There are not other possible interactions. Apparently, it is impossible for men to have peers, or so this author seems to imply. Quote, in the female system, relationships are philosophically conceived as a peer until proven otherwise. This is only true of women who feel clear and strong and have come to trust their own system. In other words, each new encounter holds the promise of equality. One does not have to be one up or one down, superior or inferior. One can be peer. Apparently, this author believes that women never get catty or backstabby and only ever see each other as unending equals. Once again, my note on this is, this author has never met a woman. But then, as I'm sure you're thinking, this is heavily influenced by the New Age school of thinking. To help demonstrate this bizarre assertion of hers, the author relays an anecdote on page 110. The author asserts that she had a conversation with a man, and when she didn't go down physically, as in she didn't shrink herself down in stature, the man apparently became panicked at the thought of a woman not going down before him, and so he just had to go one down before her. And the author, desperate to stay peer with this gentleman, stooped herself down to be on an equal level to him. And this anecdote unfolds into a comedic scene where a man is standing with a posture like a cooked prawn, and our heroic author stooping down to join him to be on his level. Yes, according to this author, men just cannot stand women who don't physically bow in their presence, and should a woman stand up tall in front of him, he will simply crumble. And anytime the woman lowers herself to equality with him, he will simply have to continue prostrating himself until he is laying completely flat on the floor. As with all of the author's anecdotes in this book, this did not happen. On page 112, the author asserts that women define their world by relationships, and that this is the reason why women achieve less than men. She asserts that men lie to women in order to get them into relationships by focusing on the woman at first, and then as time goes on, they go back to focusing on work. According to the author, women know that this means that he loves her less, but because his thinking is white male system, he doesn't realize that to be the case. Never mind the fact that many men choose to focus on their careers later in the relationship as a means of providing for the woman, because that is how they show their love and affection towards them. No, apparently women do actually need to be the center of the universe in order to feel loved. On page 119, the author begins to talk about sexuality. She asserts that the white male system defines everything by sex, including inanimate objects. She asserts that the female system doesn't define things by sexuality. Sex is not even a focus. However, female system thinkers see sex as important, fun, and sacred. The use of the term sacred there is important because of its religious connotations. The female system does not believe that sex defines the world, because if it did, that would make it white male system thinking, and that any sort of preoccupation with sex necessarily makes you some sort of istophobe, because you need to define things as straight, gay, etc. On page 121, the author goes on to talk about sex as a form of transcendence. She asserts that in focusing on sex, men use sex to achieve this spiritual transcendence, whereas women do not focus on sex at all, and so they use everything else in the world to transcend. The use of transcendence here is very important because it quite obviously signals a very spiritual aspect to these activities. And it also ties very heavily into the New Age woo movement, where women are just more spiritual than men because women use everything in the world to transcend, whereas men only think about sex as a form of transcendence. This also ties to transcendence in Hegel's writings on the topic of Aufheben, the acceleration of contradiction until the end of history, which is somewhat important because that is one of the origin points of this movement and its ideas. On page 123, the author actually asserts that the female system would see love as a flow of energy from solar plexus to solar plexus. This is something that was mentioned earlier regarding women and their void of female sin. Once again, we're seeing the spiritual and religious side of this belief system creeping in here. The author goes on to address friendships on page 126. And she asserts that men see friends as people who can be relied upon as part of a team, which is very interesting because she previously stated that men are only able to see the world in forms of one up and one down, but men are still able to have teams somehow. The author asserts that these men who team play with friends never really know who the people on their team are, to which I can't help but think this author has never met a man. By contrast, the author asserts that the female system views friends as people you can be open with and express feelings to because it is safe. This shows a very interesting contradiction between what the author asserts as being white male system thinking and female system thinking. The female system is just about expressing yourself, but not necessarily achieving anything, because, as the author has asserted, you are merely focusing on this mystical woo process, and not any sort of outcome or result, because measuring outcomes or results is white male system thinking, whereas the white male system actually results in something measurable at the end, usually some sort of improvement in a situation. In other words, it actually builds things. Chapters 6 and 7 of this book is where we really start hitting the spiritualist or the religious side of this belief system. This is the side that people like to think doesn't actually exist in feminism or intersectionality, or its various offshoots such as the critical studies and critical theories, but this spiritual or religious side is actually the basis for these ideas. And you begin to see that bleeding into this book here. And keep in mind, this book is from 40 years ago, and since then we've had some of the spiritual and religious side again waning a little bit out of this belief system, but it is still there at fundament. And you have to remember that 100 years prior to this book being written, we were talking about things such as theosophy being the origin point of these beliefs, which is strictly religious and strictly spiritual in its nature. Chapter 6 is the paradox, dualism, and levels of truth. Capital T truth in this title is very important. When you see terms like this capitalized, it means that there is some underlying truth or usually some esoteric meaning behind it. When we're talking about a spiritual system or a religious system that believes in transcendence and a dualistic system, that is, spirit being separate from body, well, you can see where this is going. Referencing back to the German idealist movement that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and their particular offshoot of Hegelian beliefs, and talking about things such as Volksgeist, the folk spirit, this is where you get various other capital terms, such as capital B, black, capital T, trans. These things in the Hegelian worldview are referring to a specific kind of collective spirit, and thus a specific kind of collective, capital T, truth. This is actually the origin point of the concept of woke, being woke to the capital T, truth of how the world really is. And you achieve this capital T truth, this knowledge of capital T truth, by your transcendence, your ascendance, your acquisition of knowledge, your gnosis of how the world works. And thus you transcend, because your spirit is not actually part of your body. This is a dualistic belief system. And then we're back to the humans aren't really material, this world is just a carceral prison, you are actually just a vibrational being of light, etc. But we'll delve into that more at a later date, going through all of the other books that I'm going through in this series. This book goes on to assert and reiterate that the process of the female system cannot truly be measured in numbers, nor by instruments. In order to understand the female system, you must relinquish both intellectual and physical control. This is because this is a religion and is spiritual in nature, and spirituality, of course, cannot be measured. After all, what is the weight of your belief? What is the distance of your faith? These are meaningless questions. They cannot be answered, because the question itself is immeasurable. The author goes on to mention that this causes some sort of paradox, and the paradox that she speaks of is right brain thinking. Whereas the white male system is left brain thinking and so cannot understand this paradox. And so if you think that this is a paradox, or you say that you cannot understand it, that's just because you're using white male system thinking and you are left brained. The author goes on to assert that female system thinkers don't just use the right brain in order to think, but they pass things to the right brain and then to the left brain and then on to the body for action. So of course you can see here the female system is just better, somehow, in a non-quantifiable way, and you can't ask for it to be quantified because then you're white male system thinking. The author goes on to state on the topic of paradox, women delight in paradox and find it stimulating and enhancing. When we experience paradox, we don't care who is in control. We realize that there is no one truth, and that all truth is one. As you can see, we're getting very heavily into the New Age woo here. The white male system forces people to think dualistically, either or. The author then relays yet another anecdote that didn't happen, of a white male student who was in one of her lectures, who apparently at some point became so irate that he stood up and shouted at her, "We have to think dualistically. There is no other way to understand the world around us. Besides, if what you're saying is true, then everything I'm learning is wrong." Obviously, this did not happen. This is not how a student would behave in a lecture. However, as the author asserts on page 157, because the white male system is either or right or wrong thinking, this of course leads us to the idea that the female system doesn't see things in these terms and everything is merely a continuum. Yes, apparently the ability to acknowledge the existence of continuums is female or female system thinking, which leads us on to the inevitable page 158, there is no such thing as truth, only different levels of truth. This is where we begin to see the postmodern moral relativism slipping in here. Nothing is objective, nothing can be measured. For people who are familiar with moral relativism, this is where you begin to see how dangerous some of these ideas can be, because under systems of absolute moral relativism, you can justify pretty much anything, because it leads you to being able to use forms of ethics such as utilitarianism and consequentialism. which are moral systems which can very easily be used to justify things like slavery and genocide. Throughout pages 160 and 161, the author goes on to talk about multiple levels of truth. This is where you really begin to see the Gnostic or pseudo-Gnostic origin of these things. When you begin talking about levels of truth and levels of reality, levels of understanding, this inevitably leads to an endpoint where you have transcended all of this knowledge. You have acquired all of this knowledge, and that leads you to a very obvious endpoint, which we've discussed before. Going through the levels somewhat in brief, level 1, we're talking about sexuality here. Level 1, people do not recognize things such as gayness or straightness because they have no words to describe such phenomena. At level 2, people know that things such as homosexuality exist, but they don't really have very much information about them, but they're vaguely aware of it. They may even use some terms in order to be derogatory or bigoted towards people who behave in such manners. At level 3, people consider themselves to be enlightened or liberal, or 40 years on in the modern parlance, progressive. They recognize and acknowledge gayness, and have worked through some of their homophobia. They know about gay people and their rights, they clean up their language a little bit, and they don't use derogatory terminology to refer to these people. At level 4, people have worked through much of their homophobia. They may have friends and family members who they openly accept as being gay and or straight. They may even be gay themselves and be okay with it. And possibly at this tier they have begun to reclaim some of the language, such as referring to the aforementioned friends as "you old dyke" or "you old faggot" in an affectionate manner. However, when you get to level 5, this is where things get interesting given the current day. A level 5 person would probably include people who did not identify persons by sexuality, they do not use those terms, and so on. So in other words, level 5 is the current day gender abolitionist position. There are no genders, there are no sexes, everything is fluid, everything is flexible, it's all just a social construct. And that is actually very important because it begins to remove the essentialism from these categories. It begins to remove the spiritual, the metaphysic, from these categories. As a side note here, this is why I think there's actually such a butting of heads between the second and third wave of feminism, or the second, third, and now fourth waves. This is not an idea in absolutes, but is merely a working theory that I am currently constructing. I'm completely open to the idea that it might be wrong, but I think that there is some kernel to it, as it's something that's on the periphery of my mind every time I see these clashes, and I'm trying to work out whether or not there is something there or not. Because when you see the "what is a woman" tier people arguing with the feminists, as they are termed now, TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, I think what you're seeing is a purely materialist, everything is just a social construct and we can change it people, the third and fourth wave, running into a second wave that does still have some sort of metaphysical aspect to it. It does still have some sort of dualism to it, that there is woman and woman can be defined, which means there is something about femaleness, there is something about womanness that is inherent to being. And I think that that is where you begin to see that the second wave had this slightly more spiritualist tradition to it, because it grew out of things like theosophy. That there is a divine feminine, there is a female spirit. That is, that there is something beyond merely the physical that makes woman woman and makes man man. And I'm not going to expound upon that too much now. As I said, it's somewhat a working theory, something that is on the periphery of my mind every time I see these people arguing, and I'm hoping that I might be able to flesh that out as time goes on, especially going through some of the older books which actually talks about the spiritual origins of the women's rights movement. Which leads us very nicely on to Chapter 7, Introduction to Female System Theology. Yes, the author has expressly stated that female system thinking has a theology to it. That is, it has a religion, it has a spiritual side, it has an underlying metaphysic. She goes on to assert that everyone should be more theological. She observes that the white male system has a hierarchy of theology that is God, men, women, children, animals, and earth, and that every layer above dominates, abuses, and rapes the levels below. On page 147, she states the white male system sees God as control and controlling, whereas the female system sees God as process. Quote, process is never constant and never static. Our natural process is God, yet God is not just our process. To live and follow our personal life process is to be with God. In the female system, living in tune with God means being in tune with what one already is. God is changing and growing. One must stay in tune with one's own personal process to remain attuned to God. Our true selves are never in conflict with God, and God is not just our process, and God is our process. End quote. This is full-on New Age woo, and is also what you see a lot in modern feminist writings and the general you go girl, girl bossing attitude that you see on social media these days. Women are always perfect in everything that they do. Everything that they do can and will be justified, and you are not allowed to have an opinion about it, because they are simply engaging with themselves as process. And the process is God, and therefore what they are doing is divine. And that is exactly what you see all of the New Age woo crystal women on Instagram doing. Everything is divine, everything is process, everything is female, the female goddess superior, etc. And of course, women are just these inherently very spiritual beings. They're very attuned to themselves, attuned to process, etc. Which is why this author will state on page 175, female system theology is process. And you'll remember from earlier that process, this female system process, cannot be defined, it cannot be measured, it cannot be constrained, it is everything and nothing. In other words, it is completely meaningless woo, which effectively translates to if a woman says it or does it, then it is right. And thus this leads the book to end with the sermon, somehow we must realize that the theology of our culture, white male system theology, forces us into a system of hierarchy and exploitation. We must begin to see how our current theological assumption serves to perpetuate the white male system and limit human freedom and growth. And now let us begin. So the author just ends her book with an assertion that the white male system that we are living under is theology and a false god. Given what we've spoken about earlier regarding the Gnostic and Hermetic tradition that inspired this, the idea that this world is a carceral construct created by a fallen god or a fallen angel, a demiurge, suddenly observations like that make complete sense. We are living in a false reality created by an evil deity, and we must acquire knowledge to acquire all of the levels of understanding so that we can break that system and be free of it, to enter the female system and transcend to return to source, return to God, return to monad, however you want to phrase it. And this is where you come to the realization that 40 years ago, women's rights, women's studies, feminism, the origin point of intersectionality was still talking about how it is theological in its basis. And that brings us to the end of the notes that I have written on this book. To remind you that the reason I'm going through this is as part of a series of reviews on a number of books. All of this is going to culminate in a video demonstrating that the women's rights movement, feminism more broadly, and intersectionality as it is known now, is a religion and has theological roots, specifically theosophical roots. I'll be doing individual book reviews of each one of the books as I go through them in a manner similar to this. It will just be me reading through the notes which I make on those books and freestyling in a little bit of extra information as I go. This came about because I was requested to make this video by someone who wanted access to the notes that I had written. Hopefully this has fulfilled that request of yours. But keep an eye out in the future. The second book which I'm going through in this large project is Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Anne Browd. So if you're interested in going through that, keep an eye out on this channel in the coming weeks for that. As I've done with this book, Women's Reality by Anne Wilson Schaef, I will probably attempt to drag the unfortunate folks at Honey Badger Radio into a discussion with me on the topic as well, because I find it very interesting to soundboard some of these ideas off of other people as well. It serves as somewhat a sanity check for myself. Links to those two discussions will be available in the box below this video. So we will leave this topic there, and I will say thank you very much for your time and attention, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully it's been of interest to you. And I will see you in however long for discussion of our next book.